the In Good Faith program is an important initiative of the Bernardin Center, and it's, of course, dedicated to furthering dialogue and furthering efforts at interreligious understanding, and also just developing relationships among Jewish, Christian, and Muslim leaders in the Chicagoland area. And tonight the topic is religious liberty and the common good, continuities and discontinuities. So we've asked our presenters to speak about important religious liberty issues that face our religious communities, and to explore some of the tensions that arise within our communities, among our faith communities, and in the public square over issues of religious liberty and public policy. We have three wonderful presenters who have agreed to tackle this question from their respective faith perspective. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, which I know is very challenging, but we try to keep within that 15 to 20 minute window. So I'm going to introduce the speakers first and then have them come up here to the table. So our speakers this evening are Dan Elbaum, Dr. David Fitch, and Dr. Amir Hussain. So I think I'll go ahead with the introducing you, and then you can come forward. So Dan Elbaum is the director of the regional offices and assistant executive director of the AJC, the American Jewish Committee. He has devoted his professional career to public service and the advancement of Jewish causes. Dan has appeared in media outlets ranging from the Chicago Tribune to NBC Dateline to Al Jazeera. He regularly meets with decision makers in Chicago and across the state to advance the well-being of Israel, combat anti-Semitism, monitor the condition of Jewish communities, and promote intergroup and interreligious understanding. He spent 6 years as a civil rights counsel and director of development for the Anti-Defamation League's Midwest region. As civil rights counsel, he drafted multiple pieces of legislation, including several amendments to the Illinois hate crime statute and an amendment to the Illinois Condominium Property Act that protects the right to keep religiously mandated items on doors. Dan also conducted hate crimes training seminars for local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies around the Midwest. Prior to entering Jewish communal life, Dan was a prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. During his tenure at the State's Attorney's Office, he tried over 100 bench and jury criminal cases in the Domestic Violence Division and the Narcotics Prosecution Bureau. He earned a BA and his JD degrees from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. Welcome. David Fitch is the B.R. Lindner Chair of Evangelical Theology at Northern Seminary here in Chicago. He's also the founding pastor of Life on the Vine Christian Community, a missional church in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. He coaches a network of church plants in the C and MA linked to Life on the Vine. He writes on the issues the local church must face in mission, including cultural engagement, leadership, and theology. He has lectured and presented on these topics at many seminaries, graduate schools, denominational gatherings, and conferences. Dr. Fitch is the author of numerous articles in periodicals such as Christianity Today, The Other Journal, Missiology, as well as various academic journals. He is the author of The End of Evangelicalism, Discerning a New Faithfulness for Mission, and The Great Giveaway, Reclaiming the Mission of the Church from American Business, Parachurch Organizations, Psychotherapy, Consumer Capitalism, and Other Modern Maladies. That's quite a title. And most recently, Prodigal Christianity, 10 Signposts into the Missional Frontier. So sounds very interesting. Dr. Fitch has a PhD from Northwestern University and his MA from Northern Baptist Seminary. Welcome. Our third speaker is Dr. Amir Hussain. Dr. Hussain teaches and publishes about Islam and Muslim lives. His research focuses on Muslim communities in North America. He also teaches about comparative religion and interfaith dialogue. For 2011 to 2015, he is the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, the premier scholarly journal for the study of religion. Dr. Hussain is a professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he teaches courses on world religions. His own particular specialty is the study of Islam, focusing on contemporary Muslim societies in North America. Although Dr. Hussain was born in Pakistan, he came to Canada with his family when he was 4, and his academic degrees, including an MA and a PhD, are all from the University of Toronto, where he has also received a number of awards, including the university's highest award for alumni service. He has a deep commitment to the students and holds the distinction of being the only male to serve as Dean of Women at the University College at the University of Toronto. Before coming to California, he taught courses in religious studies at several universities in Canada. He's active in academic groups such as the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion and the American Academy of Religion, and he's on numerous editorial boards. Welcome, Dr. Hussain.
Well, thank you. Since I go first, I get to make the speaker's joke that before I speak, let me say something. And it is an honor to be here, not just for the food, which everyone within the invitation promised me how good the food was, and it did live up to the billing, but for such an important event and to address what I think is a fascinating issue about the various faith perspectives on religious liberty and the common good. I suppose if I want to give a short answer, or an answer on one foot, as Jews like to say, I would simply say Jews favor both and call it a day. Although that might be true of people of all backgrounds, these themes have historically had a particular resonance for the Jewish community. Naturally, my organization, the American Jewish Committee, or AJC, has had traditional interest in these issues. AJC was founded in 1906 as a result of pogroms of Russia. These pogroms began after the Russian Orthodox Eastern Sunday, and the New York Times account of the day noted that angry mobs, which killed over 120 Jews and injured 500, were led by priests on that day. History of my organization is that a small group of American Jews formed AJC in the wake of that pogrom. Much has changed about the world since that time, but a few things at AJC remain the same. One is the strong, deep-seated belief that we bear responsibility for the fate of Jewish communities, not just in the U.S., but around the world. Second is the firm understanding that religious and ethnic minorities need to have their rights protected, regardless of what those minorities are. There are a number of actions that AJC takes to advocate for both the Jewish community and people of all backgrounds. However, in order to be representative of the Jewish community, we need to listen to that community. For over 20 years, AJC has conducted a yearly survey on a variety of issues of importance. That survey invariably forms a fascinating snapshot of American Jewish thought on a variety of areas. We poll regarding presidential candidates, we poll regarding events in the Middle East, and we specifically, and more relevantly today, poll on issues regarding religious liberty and freedom and free choice. So our last poll was taken in September of 2012. In that poll, we asked Jews of all backgrounds whether they identified more with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party on issues of separation of church and state. 75% of those surveyed answered Democrats, and only 23% identified Republicans. When asked the question regarding the issue of abortion, 80% of Jews identified their position with Democrats, and only 17% identified themselves as standing with Republicans. To many in the Jewish community, this might not be particularly surprising. The Jewish community has historically voted for Democratic candidates, and of course I have the understanding that not all Democrats favor the separation of church and state, nor do all Republicans certainly oppose it, nor are all Democrats pro-choice, and nor are all Republicans pro-life. However, if we're to generalize on where the community stands on those positions, I think I'd be on safe ground is saying that the Jewish community has traditionally and remains on the side of keeping a firm wall of separation of church and state, and erred on the side of personal liberty when the issues of morality came up. This may not always be the case. The Orthodox community, which is growing in number, takes very different views on several of these issues. There's also a very real debate within mainstream Jewish organizations about some of our positions on the separation of church and state and whether those positions continue to reflect our community's best interests. I will explore some of those themes later, but I think any honest examination of a Jewish position on religious liberty and the common good should start from a place of a belief in a firm adherence to the separation of church and state and skepticism and fear of any portion of society imposing their version of morality upon a sect of citizens. It's useful as a starting point to examine how we got there. For example, there's nothing in the Bible or Old Testament about the separation of church and state. Ancient Israel, after all, was a theocracy. The concepts of rendering unto civic authority non-religious decision do not appear there and later appear in the New Testament. Yet the Jewish experience in America has been different, and it's interesting to examine why. Much of that difference can be explained and understood through a simple exchange of letters that happened over 200 years ago. I'd like to take you back to the year 1790. The Constitution was less than a year old and the Bill of Rights not yet ratified. Around 2,500 Jews lived in the 13 states that were once called the colonies. Although life was infinitely better there than it was for their co-religionists in Germany, Poland, and Russia, it was not without challenges. Only 3 years before, a Philadelphia merchant had written to the Constitutional Convention, currently working on the Constitution, with the complaint that although Jews had bravely fought and died for liberty, Pennsylvania legislators could only assume office upon swearing on a New Testament and saying that the New Testament was given by divine inspiration. In the city of Newport, Rhode Island, with a city that had a thriving Jewish population, Jews were forbidden to vote and hold public office. Moses Sextus, a member of the Jewish community, an official of a local synagogue, took out his quill and wrote a letter to the newly elected first president, George Washington. Washington had concluded a goodwill tour of New England, which had included a visit to Newport. In his letter, Moses wrote the following, and I found the language so striking that I wanted to quote a large portion of the letter. But with pleasure as we reflect on these days of difficulty and danger, when the God of Israel, who delivered David from the peril of the sword, shielded your head in the day of battle, and we rejoice to think that the same Spirit who rested in the bosom of the greatly beloved Daniel, enabling him to provide over the provinces of Babylonian Empire, ever rest upon you, enabling you to discharge the arduous duties of chief magistrate in those states. He then got to his request. Deprived as we have heretofore been of invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty, disposer of all events, behold the government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming every one of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great government machine. On the one hand, in writing this letter, there was nothing historical or particularly notable from a Jewish historical perspective. For centuries, Jews had tried to curry favor of kings and queens and other rulers to attain rights or mercy for their people. The holiday of Purim, which we'll celebrate in only a few weeks, involves a similar entreaty to the king of Persia. But here it is Washington's reply that is extraordinary. George Washington wrote him back, as he had written to members of other faiths that had also written to him. And then he wrote, "The citizens of the United States of America have the right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that those who live under its protection should demean themselves as good as citizens in giving on all occasions that effectual support." Note that Washington not only repeats the language of the original letter about bigotry having no sanction, but makes clear that the concept of Jewish freedom does not come from his own personal whim. Rather, he underscores that this freedom is what has been fought for and won on the field of battle. For the first time since the destruction of the Second Temple, Jews are free as a matter of law. The Constitution has already decreed there should be no religious test in holding federal office, and the Bill of Rights a year later protects against the establishment of religion and guarantees the free exercise thereof. And Washington's views were not extraordinary among the founders. Ben Franklin regarded Jesus as a wise moral philosopher, but viewed religions more or less interchangeable. Jefferson penned Virginia's statute for religious freedom and thought it important enough to be placed on his tombstone. He did not think that highly of the presidency, which does not appear on his tombstone. And John Adams, as president, signed a treaty unanimously approved by the Senate, which declared unambiguously that America was not a Christian nation. Today, that basic principle has served the Jewish community in America well. The Jewish community is well aware of what can happen when a state associates itself with a particular religious perspective and tries to impose that perspective on others. In the 2 millennia since the Jewish people were driven out of their historic homeland, we have known persecution, subordination, and extermination. Against all that experience, the experience of the Jewish people in the United States, with whatever ups and downs, stands in stark contrast. There are many reasons for this, but part of that explanation is no doubt the principle of the separation of church and state. As I said, AJC was founded in 1906 as a result of the religiously motivated pogroms against the Jews of Russia. But very soon, AJC's leaders came to understand that the rights of Jews could only be secure when the rights of all Americans, and indeed all people, are secure. The first matter in which AJC filed a friend of the court brief in 1925 was the U.S. Supreme Court case of Pierce v. Society of Sisters, protecting the rights of Catholic parents to send their children to religious school, rather than comply with the state law requiring their children, complying with the state law. That law was overturned by the courts. It is something that we still speak about today with pride and guides us to this day. Last year, I was honored to play a role in AJC's friend of the court brief that attacked the Oklahoma constitutional amendment, which had unfairly and unjustly lashed out for no reason other than Islamophobia against Sharia law. And in doing so, we are proud to cite Pierce as part of our history of interest in the case. For the last several years, most of the high-profile church, state, or religious freedom cases have played out in our nation's schools. In many ways, that is not surprising. After all, one could argue that the fate of our children is really at stake there. A variety of federal cases have wrestled with conflicts involving moments of silence, prayers at graduation ceremonies and at football games, the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, nativity scenes in schools, and the teaching of intelligent design. Here, when examining the position of the Jewish community, there's an interesting split. The overwhelming majority of Jewish civil rights and civic organizations, as well as the Reform and Conservative movement, have consistently raised their voice in support of the separation of church and state. The Orthodox community, whose children largely attend private schools, have been more or less silent on this issue. The schism, once hardly noticed, can only take on greater significance as the population shift. The school cases often attract a fair amount of press, and one sees stories of the so-called war on Christmas. The school cases also lead to interesting judicial formulations like, quote, the reindeer rule, which means that any holiday display passes constitutional muster as long as you have a reindeer in there to make it a holiday display rather than simply a religious display. By the way, it's the same rule for holiday pageants, where singing Jingle Bells will allow you a silent night and another song too, because it becomes a holiday song as a result. There's actually court rulings on this. What is often missed within all this noise is the vast amount that is no longer in dispute. For example, allow me to name the following practices that are all constitutional and are all permitted and really unquestioned by the Jewish community or any community of issues going on in our school. Studying about religion, including studying the Bible as part of a course of study, a student saying a prayer to herself during class or reading a Bible on the school bus, or students meeting in religious clubs, in a school cafeteria during the lunch hour, or on school premises after class, a Muslim teacher wearing a traditional head covering, or a Jewish teacher wearing a Jewish head covering at all times during school, Christmas decorations and Christmas songs, and a moment of silent contemplation at the beginning of the school day. These are all constitutional. Real cases do arise, and Jewish groups have been involved in many of them. Over the last few years, I've been personally involved in several cases. One involved an Orthodox Jewish prisoner in the Indiana Department of Corrections who had been denied kosher food because of the cost. There were two separate efforts in which we became involved in Georgia. We took the side of assisting the Muslim community against legal burdens that were placed in building mosques. several cases involving high school boards beginning their sessions with sectarian prayers that endorsed one religion over the other, and as I mentioned, the challenge to the constitutionality of the Oklahoma constitutional amendment banning Sharia law. It is a point of pride that in probably a majority of religious freedom cases handled by Jewish organizations, the plaintiffs are not Jewish. It is anyone who knows the Jewish community knows that we struggle with having a universal position on any issue. The old joke that every Jew has heard of, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 4 synagogue memberships, rings true here. Issues have arisen that have caused no small debate, and I'll come close to closing by sharing 2 of them. And these are issues that our community is currently wrestling with tonight, for which we don't have answers. Today, many terrorist organizations have made no secret that they regard Jewish institutions as targets. Only a few years ago, we received a sobering reminder of that in Chicago, when our government uncovered what President Obama called a credible terrorist threat of explosives headed to 2 Jewish places of worship. The Department of Homeland Security has provided not only Jewish organizations, but religious organizations with federal grants to improve their security, and many have taken advantage. Yet some Jewish civic groups have opposed the grants as they constitute government funding of religion. This has created a very real debate in our community, with institutions wanting the protection offered by the government, and other sides arguing that any breach of the wall of separation in church and state, with money being fungible, if federal money goes to the security improvements, other money can then go toward the religious type materials, and has caused a very real debate in our community for which we lack a consensus answer. A second debate is Jews have traditionally opposed school vouchers and other public funding of religious schools. The reason is that this government funding has been traditionally held or argued that it violated the separation of church and state. Yet Jewish education is getting increasingly expensive, and many Jewish schools face shrinking membership and are failing. There's a real split in debate in the Jewish community whether an absolute position of opposition here best serves the community interest today. Communities' positions are always evolving, and a debate will continue about whether or not our position needs to evolve here. Only time will tell us what answers the Jewish community will reach on these questions, but they are debates worth having, as they are in any healthy, vigorous community. As it was in 1790, the separation of church and state and the protection of religious freedom remains an issue of importance to the Jewish community of America. It is one that is deeply rooted in our history and in large part continues to define a large part of us as a people. Much has changed since the letter was written to George Washington. Our people have found a home and a level of success and security unparalleled in our history. Indeed, to borrow from what Washington writes later in the letter, the stock of Abraham continued to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants through the protections afforded to them. They continue to have steadfast loyalty to the principles that put them in this situation, and they continue to vocally assert those rights for others. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks for inviting me. It's always comforting when the person who invited you or had a role inviting you says, "Don't embarrass me, don't embarrass me." 3 times as you're getting up here. Do love you for that, Jay. Anyways, I come. I'm doing it as we speak. Yes, sorry. I come here as what people know out there as an evangelical, but I'm not your prototype. I'm not the kind of evangelical you see on CNN or at a Tea Party demonstration or something like that. Rather, over the years, I have landed in a very comfortable place with the Anabaptist tradition, the radical Reformation, the part that said we got too close to power and we got corrupted, and we need to rethink things. And so I come here as an evangelical, but one who's got a critique for evangelicalism getting too close to money. Too close to money, too close to corporatist politics, too close to things like that. So the subject this evening is really interesting to me: religious liberties and the common good. And first, I'll just say a few words about the strange way evangelicals, people of my tradition, think about and do religious liberties. It's a strange galvanizing issue within the politics of evangelicalism. we at once laud religious liberties as a sign that United States is a righteous nation. But then it seems almost within the same breath we end up denying these same rights by fighting against some other religious liberty in the name of religious liberties. And since I teach at a Baptist seminary, that's when I would say amen, but I won't do that here. So contradictions abound in the way my tradition handles religious liberties. This is perhaps most obvious, or at least contentious, when us evangelicals seem to fight adamantly to limit lesbian and gay rights, rights to practice marriage between same-sex couples. We evangelicals, we hold on to the notion that sexuality, marriage, having children, family, those are not merely individual preferences, but those are in essence theological beliefs. And therefore we want to maintain the freedom to believe and act appropriately on those issues, as well as not being impinged upon by wider society. And so in the name of religious liberty, strangely, I told you it was strange. Strangely, we seek to limit others' expression of marriage, which we most certainly know they define as a religious expression. So there's a strange contradiction there. And so the question might be, how did this happen? But before I go there, just to prove my point a little bit more explicitly, Religious News Service, in an article published by Huffington Post last month, the title of the article was "Poll Shows Double Standard on Religious Liberty." And it did this great poll that basically showed the same people who are scared to death of losing their religious liberties are the same people who believe that the gay-lesbian issue is impinging on them, right? So again, it just proves my point. Am I proving my point, Jay?
Yeah.
Thank you. And on top of this, same time, same station, not same station, but First Things, the magazine, has an editorial, same month. Will evangelicals stand up for religious liberties? And they were referring to evangelicals standing up for these liberties in relation to, well, I don't know how you call them liberties, but they were referring to these same issues from the other side. Do you see how religious liberties has maybe not worked out like we thought it was going to work out, at least in my peeps, among the people that I minister to? And I could go on and on and on about this, which I won't. But you'll remember when this contradiction raised its ugly head, when President George Bush, who was a self-identified evangelical, lifted up United States as a country blessed of God because it protected religious liberties, the right to worship, the right to conscience, and then he went and bombed another country in the name of freedom. This is what good ideologists do. And I'm looking at your faces right now and going, am I going to make it out of here? But we point out the contradictions in what's happened in the way we use religious liberties. So evangelicals feel, according to this poll, 71% of evangelicals are extremely concerned about religious freedoms becoming more and more restricted over the next 5 years. The same percentage believes that gay-lesbian community is the most active group trying to renounce Christian values from this country, which is another way to say we've got to stop that. And so you can see that the inner contradiction. And so my question here is, where does this come from? How did this happen? And how does this maybe inform how maybe we, maybe you, maybe us can work together and maybe refocus where we put our energies in relation to exercising our religious liberties? So let's just say the obvious. Religious liberties have been used as a defense mechanism in society. Religious liberties have been interpreted to mean liberty to protect my religious beliefs over against incursion. And so evangelicalism over the last 30 years has really made a cottage industry, forming organizations to lobby government. Government is a solution. We will go through government to solve our problems. Various places like Focus on the Family, Family Research Council, Christian Coalition, National Association of Evangelicals, Faith and Freedom Coalition, etc., have spent enormous sums of money to lobby the government to get legislation done. And so, quite to the contrary, religious liberties have enforced almost an antagonism in society between religions, or between various issues of religious belief and practice. And so I have just a couple of simple responses to this whole cultural mess that we're in, that I offer for discussion. First suggestion, let us de-emphasize the state. Let us de-emphasize the state as where we're going to choose to work out our public life together. Somehow, at least those of us I can't speak for the other faith traditions here today, but I feel very strongly that the Christian traditions, especially my own, but I believe other Protestants and I can't really speak for the Catholics, but sometimes I see you doing the same thing, those of you who are Catholics. We default to the state as the primary site from which we're going to all join together and make it happen and legislate the common good. When we do this, what I want to suggest is that the religious liberties get absorbed into the antagonism and the violence of the state. Does that make any sense to anyone else who's not an Anabaptist? Oh, okay, I got a few. That nod means an amen from where I'm from. I almost said praise the Lord. This is how religious liberties, freedom to worship, freedom of conscience, turns to freedom to defend my turf. Code for win an election. That will solve our problems. Win an election. And there are many theories why this happens, but I've read enough Foucault and Gilles Deleuze and Hart and Negri to know that power is dispersed away from government. There's so much power and so much powers at work in capitalism, the networks of distribution, the consumerism, the ways we have to buy things and sell things, that we should see, we should see the possibility, in the words of Foucault, of let's behead the king. Let's behead the king. He didn't mean that literally, because when Foucault was speaking in France during that time, there was no king. What he meant to say is, let's get rid of the government as our primary site from which to work out our differences and work for the common good, and realize there's all these other powers, all these other global forces of capitalism that are shaping and forming us into subjects of capitalism. So we can now see, if we follow Foucault, we can see how you put religious liberties into this framework, they become territorialized to achieve what's best for me and my own tribe. So if there's one thing you can take away from my little piece in this is, how can we avoid religious liberties being territorialized so that they become turned into how best to achieve what's best for me and my own tribe? I argue that government and the way it individualizes and democratizes things in a bad way creates that dynamic of antagonism, me against you. And we all know this making religion into a personal choice, a private liberty, has worked against at least us evangelicals. Does anyone notice how evangelicals compete to have the best worship service on Sunday morning? Have the best. Jay, do you have the best rock band in Wheaton? Mainline. Okay. And what happens is our churches get Ephraim Radner in Toronto says contrastive identities. We become identified as churches over against by what we're over against. We're the seeker church. We care about seekers. I don't know if anyone knows this language but me. We are the hip, cool, emergent liturgy church. We're the church that believes in justice, and those people are not. Back in the 40s, we're the Bible church, and everybody else doesn't believe in the Bible. You understand what I'm saying? So anyways, what happens is when we make religion, we got to be careful. I'm just saying we got to be careful about religious identities, religious preferences, the freedom to choose, and it becomes the means by which we identify and individualize our faith. So my final and last suggestion, so I'm saying let's de-emphasize the state and all the things it does to us and our religious liberties. And instead, let's focus that energy locally. Local congregations working in discerning projects for the common good. I know it's not brilliant, but I think it solves some of the problems. If we focus religious liberties, once the conversation becomes national, once the conversation becomes about health care and you're forcing us to provide contraceptive services for the nation, it becomes ideologized. Once we can focus locally on what's going on in the healthcare needs of our local, and we can bring together Muslim, Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and we can talk about what do we need to do here, the ideology goes. And we're able to have conversations. When people come together from different faiths, too often they're being formed out of the national conversations. And amongst my people, it's Focus on the Family Radio or Family Research Council or Rush Limbaugh. I don't know how he got in there, but he... And communication and politics depends upon having an enemy. And you see how national politics turns us against one another? But if we start local... George Lindbeck, the ecumenicist Lutheran, always used to talk about how we need to build local congregations with thick traditions. And it's those thick traditions so that we know who we are, where we came from, why we believe what we believe, so that we can then have ecumenical discussions among us together for local common projects. Too often the flattening of religion, the flattening of our faiths, has taken the substance out of our discussions and kept them national and ideological instead of local. So when we start local, we engage relationally in these open spaces for the common good, and that's where the common good can take root for us all. Thanks.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you to Dan, and warm greetings from Rabbi Mark Diamond, a longtime friend at AJC in Los Angeles, and thank you to David. Thanks to Saleha for the AV, which will come on in a minute. My students tell me I'm much more interesting if I show someone else. And thanks to Janet for the arrangements, and to Sheila for inviting me here. And in that very kind introduction, Sheila mentioned the most important fact, not that I'm a Muslim, but that I'm a Canadian. And as a Canadian, I always have to start, thank you, with Canadian examples. And so whenever I think of religious liberty and the common good, I think of the man that my fellow Canadians voted as the most important, not the most famous, the most important Canadian. This was a CBC poll about 8 years ago, and much to everyone's surprise, it wasn't Wayne Gretzky. Gretzky finished third. It was Tommy Douglas. Now, I don't know how many of you know the name Tommy Douglas. Tommy's grandson is Kiefer Sutherland, a very fine Canadian actor. That's not why we picked Tommy Douglas as the most important Canadian. We picked Tommy Douglas because the reason that we have socialized medicine in Canada, and as a Canadian, I know the difference between socialized medicine and Obamacare, which is not socialized medicine. The reason that we have socialized medicine is because of Tommy Douglas, who, coming out of the Christian social gospel, movement, standing in front of the Saskatchewan legislature in 1961, said that it was his Christian duty to take care of his neighbor. Not that it was his neighborly duty, but that it was his Christian duty. This is why we need to have health care in my country. And Tommy certainly wasn't saying that only Christians take care of their neighbors. Tommy was smart enough to know that the Christian teaching on that, of course, comes straight out of the Jewish tradition. Muslims have that same teaching. The Common Word document that I'm sure you're all familiar with talks about that love of God, love of neighbor, the two great commandments, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And so on the one hand, I understand the role of religious liberty, and the common good. The imposition of particular religious opinion, and I celebrate that. I think and this put me out there, I think my country is better off for having universal health care. The fact that we take care of each other because we see that as our duty to each other, not as citizens, but as religious folks. That's crucial here. But that, of course, leads us into the question of what do you do with majority-minority rights? What do you do when you're the minority versus when you're the majority? Because when Tommy made that statement, when those laws were enacted, Canada very much was a Christian country. When my parents came to Canada in 1970, there were probably 30,000 Muslims in the country. The results of the last census haven't come out yet. All of us estimate it'll be about 800,000 Muslims. So huge increase from 1970 to now. But we've done some not so nice things, in the history of my country. And I gave you a great example. Let me give you the other example, the not so nice one. And that was the rebellion in 1885, roughly the same time as your Civil War. Louis Riel was one of the leaders of that in the Northwest, the area that is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan. And in 1870, he wrote these prophetic words about the small group of Métis, the children of typically French fathers and Aboriginal First Nations mothers. And John Ralston Saul has a fabulous book called A Fair Country that talks about how Canada really is a Métis culture. It's not, we make the mistake of looking at it either as French or as English. We forget the Aboriginal in that. And so here's Louis Riel standing up for his people, the Métis, French Aboriginal. And he writes this about the small group in Manitoba in 1870. Our population, he writes, was small. But in its smallness, it had its rights. The other was great. But in its greatness, it had no greater rights than the rights of the small, because the right is the same for everyone. And then that stayed with me. The right is the same for everyone. What do you do with greater and lesser numbers? What about some of the issues here? We've talked about one of them, the gay marriage issue. 2008 in the election, we had Proposition 8 in California for legalization of same-sex marriage. And I'm not saying that's not an important issue for Muslims, for my gay and lesbian Muslim friends. That's a huge issue for them. I think for the larger Muslim community, that isn't one of the big issues. We'll talk about what some of those big issues are. But I was really pleased with a statement that the Muslim Public Affairs Council put out during the election in 2008. And they're the biggest Muslim political action committee. And they issue a voting guide that talks about Muslim perspectives. And of course, all the diversity of Jewish and Christian perspectives are there in the Muslim community as well. And their take on Proposition 8, same-sex marriage, was really interesting because they said, look, traditional Islamic teaching is that homosexual behavior is inappropriate. We cannot condone this. Marriage has to be between a man and a woman. But what they said was, if you're going to vote against this amendment because you think, A, this means imams are going to be forced to perform same-sex marriages in the masjids, or 2, you think this means that Islamic schools will have to teach homosexuality as an acceptable lifestyle, neither of those things is correct. And I love that. Don't give in to the fear, because I don't know what's like with the campaign here, but the campaign in California, a lot of fear. If we pass this law, this is what will happen. And I love them to say, no, this is not what will happen. If we're going to vote in this, let's at least vote honestly out of our religious convictions, not out of any fear of something that actually isn't going to happen here. Women. in positions of authority. You're all familiar with questions of women leading religious communities, women leading prayer for Muslims. And again, I'm not saying that's not an important issue. I think for many of us it is. What are the roles of women in authority? That's not a huge issue in terms of religious liberty for Muslims in America. The huge issue is really, and this is the handout that's been going around, is the attempt to really criminalize our religious tradition. Before I moved to Los Angeles, one of the films that I saw, John Carpenter's a wonderful filmmaker for whatever you think of John Carpenter. I think he makes really good films. But it was the film Escape from Los Angeles. You probably know Escape from New York with Kurt Russell. There's this great scene in Escape from Los Angeles where, and this is like 5 years before 9/11, where there's a character who's Persian, and Los Angeles has become sort of the nation's prison, the same way New York was in Escape from New York. And he says, well, why are you here? And he says, well, I was a Muslim from Ohio. Then they made that illegal. And that was really funny in the 1990s. It's not funny anymore for us. And that's the issue here. The anti-Sharia bills that Dan was talking about. What you've got, and thank you to Matt for passing them out. I don't have enough for everyone. But it was a brief that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, did 2 years ago on the anti-Sharia bills and what they actually meant. We had a really lovely conference at LMU, and this is a great example of those connections. Here we are at a Jesuit university working with the Shura Council of Southern California and the ACLU doing a conference on Sharia, the threats supposedly of Sharia law to America. And we brought Heather Weaver, she's not named there, but she's the one that wrote that report. And for me, the best way of talking about it, if we can get the video up, is not me to talk about the issue, but someone who's much better than me at talking about this issue, who does it in a much better and much more succinct way than I could in half an hour or so. Sure. And this clip, I'm trying to do some interfaith work, in the clip here, because the clip is not a American Muslim, it's an American Catholic that some of you may know. Sure. No, that's fine. So that, it really is, that for us is one of the key issues, the anti-Sharia legislation in so many states that essentially, doesn't name it as such because the people are smarter than that, but seeks to criminalize essentially the practice of Islam, and that becomes quite problematic. Another issue that becomes problematic for us and should be problematic for you. You who are American citizens, and this one I can hide behind my Canadian citizenship here. And that was the justice ruling that came out last week, the Anwar al-Awlaki ruling. And I remember I was actually I'm delighted that Amina McLeod, I don't mean to out you there, but that Amina's back there. She organized this wonderful conference in 2011 in October on Islam in America. And we were there, and I had this conversation with Sherman Jackson, someone that you know here who's spoken to you. It was about 3 days after Anwar al-Awlaki, the cleric, was killed. And I thought, okay, this is interesting, because this is a bad person. There's no question that this is a bad person, But he's also an American citizen. And can the president order the execution of an American citizen? Does being an American citizen carry with it, certain rights, certain privileges there? And that's crucial. That should be an issue for you. Can the American president authorize the killing of an American citizen? And the Awlaki case is a perfect test case because he's a bad guy. There's no question. We can't fall back on, well, maybe he was innocent. There may be presumption of that. No, this is a bad guy. But can you then say this is a bad guy and we're done? Do you have to go through due process here? Oh, perfect. So we're able to get this. This is the anti-Sharia thing.
shooting Burkhanite at the Tulsa Hooters. Unfortunately, in other states, Sharia law is still coming at us in a very creepy way.
We're seeing Sharia creep along in all kinds of Western countries.
Fears that Sharia law is creeping into the United States.
There is something called creeping Sharia.
Are you familiar with the phrase Sharia creep?
Creeping into everyday American life inside a sandwich.
Right. A sandwich of death. And for once, I'm not talking about Arby's. And that's why threat number 3 is radical Muslim snacks. As usual, Pat Robertson was all over this meat menace.
Halal food, it sounds innocent. I mean, hey, what's wrong with kosher? Well, that's fine. I like kosher.
Oh, there is no greater friend of kosher than Pat Robertson. I was so far to call him a Hebrew nationalist. Pat knows the danger of halal.
Halal is prepared according to the rules of Sharia law.
An important distinction, folks. To slaughter an animal under kosher rules, you cut across the neck of a conscious animal with a non-serrated blade in one clean attempt, avoiding the spinal cord. But under halal, you cut across the neck of a conscious animal with a non-serrated blade in one clean attempt, avoiding the spinal cord while saying the name of Allah. That radicalizes the brisket. No problem, you say. I just won't eat it, right? That's what the people in Britain thought.
The London Daily Mail investigation found that Britain's major supermarket chains, fast food restaurants, even some hospitals and schools were serving halal food without telling those who were eating it.
They're eating secret Muslim food. And that's even worse than whatever it is the British consider food now. And folks, halal has got America in its creep sights.
In the United States, McDonald's, Walmart, and Whole Foods now offer halal choices.
Not choices. Folks, we are dangerously close to being served filet on fish. On McCheese.
I love Colbert, because only he can do that, as a good Catholic, by the way, in 3 minutes. Just talk about the real issues and the real problems there. So that issue, I think that's that key issue for Muslim communities. The extrajudicial killings, the Anwar the drone strikes, all those kinds of things. And then mosques. A couple of years ago, it was the Ground Zero mosque. But that's not new. When I moved to Los Angeles in 1997 and lived in the San Fernando Valley, it took me literally a year driving by the mosque on the freeway before I knew it was the mosque, because it looked like a school. It's a flat, one-story brick building, no minarets, no domes. And this was built in 1996, long before 9/11. And the issue was the neighbors didn't want the mosque in their neighborhood. And if the mosque was in their neighborhood, they didn't want it to look like a mosque. So it looks like, if I showed you a picture of it, you'd think this is an elementary school. Just last week in Los Angeles, a case in the South Bay, in the city of Lomita, where you had a mosque that for years wanted to renovate, and for years was defeated by the city council. And finally they sued, and the Department of Justice just stepped in last week and ruled that, in fact, the city had violated the rights of the people there. I mean, it's one thing to say, look, we're concerned about parking that this new mosque will create. It's another thing entirely when the study that supports this says, oh, this will actually help with the parking. So you can't make that argument. The mosque that I pray at in LA, it was just a year ago, and the mosque has been there for 10 years, where they were finally able to convince the local authorities, it happens to be in Culver City, California, to change the no parking on the streets for street cleaning that used to be, for the last 10 years, Fridays between 11 and 2. And you think, what an interesting coincidence. I wonder who's using this space Fridays between 11 and 2. You know, we were finally able to get them changed after 10 years to change it to Wednesday from 11 to 2. And as far as we know, that hasn't impacted any of the other religious communities there. But it's that kind of work. You know, how do you do this? And this is where I'll end, because this is where we need you, you know. Because you were once us, you know. When I speak to Catholic communities, I'm always startled at the number of my students who don't understand their own history as Catholics. You know, how this strange immigrant religion of foreigners 200 years ago wasn't Islam, it was Catholicism. You know, we had a thing at my university around the Ground Zero Mosque, and I read something, and what I read was talking about how we had to build this mosque and how we had to defend this, had to build this place and defend it. I changed enough of the words around. It wasn't anything about the Ground Zero Mosque. It was Archbishop Hughes talking about St. Patrick's Cathedral and having to have, and I love this, the ancient order of Hibernians to protect the mosque, the cathedral, from Protestant mobs who wanted to burn it down. And they actually damages a part of that. You know, so that sense of what's it mean to be a persecuted minority. I've learned that from my Jewish colleagues, you know, and I'll end there, that a couple of years ago, I had this extraordinary privilege of teaching a course at LMU on Muslim-Jewish dialogue with Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, you know, who was the rabbi, the Hillel director at UCLA. Wonderful, wonderful guy and lovely, lovely scholar as well. And it was really in doing that course with him that I came to that realization, because ballpark, there's about as many Jews as there are Muslims. Roughly speaking, 6 to 7 million Jews, roughly speaking, 6 to 7 million Muslims in America. And so my experience of growing up as a minority, I thought was that Jewish experience of growing up as a minority. And at some level, of course, that's true. You know, I love going to Jewish functions because I don't have to ask about the food. You know, is there pork in this? Is there bacon in this? You don't have to do any of that. But what Chaim pointed out to me, and it was funny because you live here and you understand this, but you really don't understand it. He goes, yeah, except that if all the Jews in America were wiped out, there'd only be about 6 million Jews in the world. You know, if all the Muslims in America were wiped out, there'd still be 1 billion Muslims in the world. And that's where it sinks in, you know, the numbers. That's where I started off with the greetings, you know, from Rabbi Diamond at AJC. That's where I do work with AJC, you know, in Los Angeles, because I think that's crucial. That I think we need to work together. And the problem, and David was great at this, I think there's so many instances where we're set apart from each other, and the nature of the political system that actually divides us from each other, rather than connecting us to each other. Thank you.